Well, that was the shot heard all around the world, or at least all around Los Angeles. Surfin' by the Beach Boys, released on the Kandak's record label. Author and researcher Jim Murphy joins us. His outstanding book is called Becoming the Beach Boys, 1961 to 1963. It's really the only book of its kind, focused solely on the group's formative years. It also serves as an excellent resource for learning about the inner workings of independent record labels during the 50s and early 60s. Jim, welcome to our Beach Boys Bash.
Well, thank you very much.
I would imagine that there are some people in the audience listening right now who at one time or another picked up what they thought was a Beach Boys greatest hits album. And they put the record on the turntable, dropped the needle, and heard a song like Surfer Girl, but it wasn't quite the way they remembered it. What led you to write a book about the group and these early recordings?
Well, I became a Beach Boy fan in October of 1966, actually through my older brother, Rich, who first heard Good Vibrations and just had to find the record. And we went out on this quest. We found Good Vibrations, and then after that we bought every record, every single, every B-side, every album that we could find by the Beach Boys. So I've been a Beach Boy fan since I was 10 years old, and I'm 59 now, so a long, long time a Beach Boy fan. So I've read every book I could possibly read about the band. I read every article on both sides of the Atlantic, watched every movie, every documentary, and I have nothing but the utmost respect for anyone who has written a book. But all the previous Beach Boy authors, it never seemed to me that I could find one reasonable, sensible, cohesive account of how they met, how they formed, how they first wrote Surfin', how they recorded it for Kandak, how they go on to sign a 7-year contract with Capitol. I kept thinking, well, gee, it can't be that difficult. It wasn't that long ago, so I just started looking into it. And I love origin stories. I love how, Bruce Wayne becomes Batman. I loved how Winston Churchill becomes Winston Churchill and helps save the world. So I just love the idea of, these mostly teenage kids, literally this quintessential American garage band, renting instruments, writing a song, getting a contract or getting a record on a local label, having a number 3 hit in L.A., which was, pretty significant, and then going on to what we know and love as the Beach Boys. So I just wanted to try to find out more about the origin story, but everything that was out there, and I read everything, and I cross-referenced it and, transcribed things, and I could not make one cohesive narrative out of all the things that were written. It almost seemed as if I was trying to put together a crossword, or a jigsaw puzzle, rather, with pieces from more than one puzzle. As if someone had thrown in pieces from another puzzle, and I was looking at pieces that just would never fit.
The story of how the Beach Boys formed has been shrouded in myth, and I'm sure that's what you came across when you were reading those books. And you point out in your book that even eyewitnesses to an event can grow so accustomed to hearing a story told over and over that they themselves start to believe the myth. How do you distinguish between fact and fiction? How do you parse out what's true or not true from the people you talk to for the book?
Well, that's a very good point, because memory is a very funny kind of fickle thing with people, and these events go back 50 years. So I was very, very cognizant when I spoke to people and interviewed people for the book that these events go back a long time. They may not remember. And then there's also the human phenomena sometimes to remember things the way we wish they had happened.
Right.
And then also the idea of, some people want to perhaps, beef up their credentials a little bit and perhaps make themselves a little bit more involved in the story than they actually were. A lot of it is just talking to so many different people and then seeing, what seems to really ring true, what always kind of floats to the surface and seems to ring true. And also, you develop kind of a sixth sense when you do a lot of interviews as to whether or not people are, being straight with you and giving you the honest recollection. When you hear things like, Jim, I just don't remember that. That's usually a good sign that they're telling you what they do remember, and then they're being very, very honest with you that I don't remember. So you do. I did about 75 to 80 interviews, I think, for the book. Friends, family, colleagues, other bandmates, from competing bands in the day, and you get a good sense of what happened, and then there's a little bit of leap of faith too, as to speculation as to what is reasonable, what reasonably happened. Putting yourself back in that place and time. But I think that's a challenge for anybody who writes about events, somewhat in the past.
Hey, you know what? It's happened to me. I mean, I remember watching a TV special, and I remembered it one way, and then 30 years later, I saw it again, and it was completely different from the way I remembered it. And I thought, am I just going crazy? But it's a phenomenon. It's something that does happen to people.
Sure, absolutely. We conflate memories. We remember the event, but not the date.
Right.
And it may not just be the way we remember it. So I think even the guys themselves, I think, when they talk about, the Height Morgan days and, that summer of '61 when they first got together and thought of forming a band, they have been through so many songs and recording sessions and tours and concerts in the intervening 50-plus years. It's understandable that they may not remember everything the way it happened.
Right. You mentioned all the people you interviewed. If I'm not mistaken, your book, once again, Becoming the Beach Boys, is the first book to give us any insight into Brian's first serious girlfriend, Judy Bowles. She's a pivotal figure in Beach Boys history because she inspired several of Brian's best-loved songs from those early years.
I'm glad you mentioned Judy, actually, because she's kind of all the people that I interviewed in the book, I think she was probably the most enjoyable to speak to.
Huh.
And it kind of began as a little bit of frustration and astonishment, because, again, in reading every single book, it never struck me that anyone had actually interviewed her. She's mentioned in virtually every book.
Right.
Because, as you point out, she was Brian's first serious romantic relationship. But it seemed to me that no one had ever interviewed her. So it took me quite a while to find her, actually, and then it took me even longer to gain her confidence and her trust. But when she granted an interview with me, and I have many, many hours of interview with her, she was just a wonderful, lovely person to speak to. Still loves Brian to this day, actually, still has a very, very special place in her heart for Brian. But she meets Brian in the summer of '61 before the Beach Boys form. She's there during the rehearsal sessions for Surfin'. They were inseparable. They went out every single day. They talked on the phone. They were virtually inseparable. And when I first spoke to Judy, she said, Jim, you're the first person to actually kind of take the time to find me and to speak to me. She said she reads every book about Brian and the Beach Boys, and she said virtually everything written about me has really not been true.
Huh.
So it was a real pleasure to kind of finally find her and bring her story into a Beach Boy book. Because, again, she meets Brian before the band. She's there when the band is formed. They're engaged to be married. Brian buys her a diamond engagement ring for Christmas of 1962. And then by October, November of 1963, with the guys just taking off like crazy worldwide, their relationship kind of falls apart. But it's a good 2.5-year relationship, bracketing the formation of the Beach Boys and really their rise to fame. Love and Mercy, which, every Beach Boy fan probably has seen and loved, a wonderful job. I just love the portrayals and the acting. But it made me, I came out of the theater and I thought, boy, I would love to see a film adaptation of Brian and Judy's early romance, because it truly was a great love story. They were both very young in life, and then kind of through the success and the fame of the Beach Boys, their lives just went, in completely different directions. But it was that bittersweet kind of thing. But Judy's responsible for, of course, the song Judy. That's a no-brainer.
Right, that's a given.
Yeah, that's a given. But she was also very much the inspiration for Surfer Girl. She surfed every day. She had her own surfboard. She was almost like the real-life Gidget. So she's very much the inspiration for Surfer Girl. And then, and this is somewhat controversial, I believe she's also the inspiration for The Warmth of the Sun.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you read the book.
It makes sense when you read the book, I think, when you read the lyrics.
Yes.
Yeah, when you read the lyrics to Warmth of the Sun, and of course it's also associated with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and it does create that very melancholy, sad feeling of longing.
Right.
But it always made more sense to me that it was more about the breakup with Judy Bowles. And there's specific lyrics there that I'm sure your listeners are very, very familiar with. When you listen to that and you put it as to when it was written, and it was right around the time that Judy and Brian were breaking up.
Boy, that sounds like a segue if I ever heard one. You're listening to our third annual Beach Boys Bash. Our guest this hour is author Jim Murphy, author of the book Becoming the Beach Boys, 1961 to 1963. Your book goes into the history of the Height Morgan sessions, the Kandak's record label. This had to have been a gargantuan undertaking. As I said in the introduction, even if you really don't care for the Beach Boys, if you're just a record collector, if you're just fascinated with the independent record label scene at that time, there is a wealth of information here. How difficult was it to track down those historical documents, to speak to the people involved in those record labels? And can you explain just sort of the short version of how important those labels were to the music industry at that time?
Sure. Well, in the 1950s and the early 60s, Los Angeles had probably hundreds of small little independent record labels. And Kandak Enterprises was formed by four brothers, the Dix brothers, twins Robert and Richard, and then Alan, and then Sherman. A fifth brother, Theodore, was not involved in the music industry. But they formed this record company in August of 1960, and they're doing pretty well, actually. They wind up doing about 41 singles. They never did an album, but they had people like Lou Rawls, Fay Reese, and some other people who go on to be quite famous, actually, the Moon Gooners. So anyway, the Beach Boys, their first record is brought to Kandak's, and they're the ones that give them their first shot, basically. But Kandak's has financial problems, and they're undergoing a lot of internal strife at the time. They can't press enough copies to keep the distribution network flush with records. And Kandak's Surfin' hits number 3 in Los Angeles, which is very respectable for the first record. But it stalls nationally at number 75 in both Billboard and Cashbox. So the feeling was that Surfin' probably could have gone much further and could have been a bigger national hit had it been on a bigger, more financially stable record label.
Right.
But finding Kandak's that was the beginning of my research. I worked on the book for about 8 years. In my real life, I'm a veterinarian. I'm a companion animal veterinarian. So I did a lot of work at night and on weekends, on days off, things like that. But finding some information out about Kandak's records, that was kind of like the very, very first serious interview that I did. And I spoke to the attorney. I found the attorney and his phone number, and I spoke to the attorney who's affiliated or associated with Kandak's back in the day. And I called the number, and I was astonished that he answered the phone. And he was equally astonished because he said, boy, I haven't heard the name Richard and Robert Dix in many, many years. So he put me in touch with them. They were kind enough to send me everything they had still about the record company, records, documents, metal stampers, reel-to-reel tapes, all kinds of things, actually, which it took me a long time just to kind of pour through and find out, the history of Kandak's. Then I interviewed them, of course, just to find out who these people were. But I think getting back to your question, the bigger issue was, one of the things about the book was I didn't want to just talk about the Wilson brothers and Mike Love and Jardine and David Marks. They were the core members of the Beach Boys, of course, and they're the spine of the story. But I wanted to kind of shed some light and find out more about these other key players. Who were the Dix brothers? Where did they come from? What was Kandak's? And then Height and Dorinda Morgan were always, another thing that I always kind of came away from other books with was they got kind of the short shrift a little bit. It was like, okay, well, who were the Morgans? They record the first 9 recordings for the Beach Boys. And who were these people? So Height and Dorinda had both passed away by the time I began the research on the book. But their son, Bruce Morgan, who was, in his 20s at the time the Beach Boys were recording for his parents, and I mentioned his age because his memory was quite good of the early days and the rehearsal sessions and things like that. So when I spoke to Bruce, and I spoke to him many, many times over many, many years, actually, and he was extremely gracious and generous with his time and patience with just question after question after question, just trying to piece together, who were all these people that really contributed to their early success. And I'm proud of the fact that in the book, you can learn more about the Dix brothers, Height and Dorinda Morgan, Nick Vinay at Capitol
Yeah.
Records, Russ Regan, Joe Saraceno. They all had a piece in really trying to launch their career, whether it was intentional or not. But I mean, they all had a role in launching their career. And of course, the boys, their talent just bubbles up to the surface, and when they sign with Capitol, they're off and running.
We're talking to Jim Murphy, author of the book Becoming the Beach Boys, 1961 to 1963. I've said this elsewhere, I'll say it again. The history of the Beach Boys is like one big Etch-a-Sketch. And when you read your book, Becoming the Beach Boys, it's like taking that Etch-a-Sketch and starting all over again, because it's just full of surprises and information that helps you as a Beach Boys fan connect the dots as to who these guys were and why it happened and how it happened. I'd like to talk just for a moment about Murry Wilson, because if you read other books about the Beach Boys, you're told that Murry was an unsuccessful songwriter, which he was. I mean, he never got the brass ring. And his main claim to fame was that Lawrence Welk performed one of his songs on television. But as your book points out, he did get his songs, good or bad, depending on, what side of the fence you're on. He did get those songs released on wax. I mean, I'll Hide My Tears by the Jets. Some of my listeners, if I tell them the Jets, they're going to fall out of their chairs. I mean, it's not something to be dismissed.
No, not at all. Murry Wilson is as you know, and as your listeners know, or any Beach Boy fan knows, he's a controversial figure.
Yeah.
And I always tell folks, I don't pretend to know what happened at the Wilson home and Murray's strengths and weaknesses, his pluses and his minuses as a father raising the boys. And we've all heard the stories, mostly, from the Tom Nolan piece in Rolling Stone, and that was peppered a lot with stories from Nick Vinay. But I kind of tend to think that Murry gets a bad rap. Murry, when you spoke to everybody who was older at the time, guys like Fred Vail, Chuck Britz was on record, before he passed away, speaking very highly about Murry Wilson. The folks who own Gold Star were very, very highly supportive of what Murry Wilson did for his boys and for the group in general. So there's this kind of dichotomy with Murry. Did he go over the line with his discipline? I guess. I mean, if the stories are true, I guess so.
Yeah.
Did he not know when to pull back? Sure. But he was a strong, assertive force for the Beach Boys, and I kind of believe that without his really pushing for them and really assertive personality, they may not have gotten the chance that they needed to kind of show their talent. I think guys like Brian Wilson and Mike Love and the rest of the Beach Boys, they needed that initial spark, that initial drive. And I think it came from people like Murry Wilson. It also came from Gary Usher. Gary Usher played a tremendous role, I think, in motivating Brian to go into Western in April of '62, re-record Surfin' Safari, record 409, record Lonely Sea, and get out there and beat the bushes and knock on record company doors. That motivation largely came from Gary Usher. But Murry had the Jets, like the record you mentioned, I'll Hide My Tears, by the Jets on Aladdin Records, 78 and a 45. That record goes for a lot of money because vocal group collectors just go crazy over it, and that's a Murry Wilson tune. Murry comes out of the World War II generation and the Depression generation. And his musical tastes are more big band, what he called nice music and sweet music. Those were his musical tastes.
Yeah.
And that's what he loved. But he filled that home with music. They had a piano, they had an organ, they had a jukebox. Brian had a nice record collection. He was considered a natty dresser at Hawthorne High School. Carl had a guitar. He had guitar lessons. He had an amplifier. Dennis had all kinds of things, BB guns and go-karts. For a middle-aged and middle-of-the-economy, hard-working guy with a stay-at-home mom who probably had her hands full with 3 boys, 2 years apart. I thought Murry did pretty well for himself, actually, and I think he was probably not all that different from a lot of fathers of the age of that era. So I always thought that Murray's perhaps his biggest weakness was at some point he should have pulled back and said, Brian, Mike, you guys have got it. You're doing well. I love you. I'll be here to support you. But I think you know what you're doing. I'll pull back.
Yeah, if only.
If only, yeah.
If only.
Yeah.
Where could people go to find out about your book, how to get it, and learn additional information that may not be in the book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I formed a companion website. It's very simple to remember. It's just the title of the book, basically, becomingthebeachboys.com. And the manuscript at one point was very, very long. I had to pare it down. So a lot of the stories that did not make it into the book itself are on the website, and I'll be adding stories on a weekly basis to that. So the book itself is available through Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, and through McFarlane Publishing, the publisher itself, actually their website. And then the companion website is kind of meant for a supplemental reading. If you like the book, if you read the book, and you want to read more, some of it is new stories, new photographs, and then some of them are basically extended versions of stories that might appear in the book. So it's just meant to be as a supplemental reading for folks who really enjoyed the book in the first place.
I remember you saying that you hoped the book would, inspire some discussion and some revelations, maybe.
Sure.
Not to be egotistical here, but I'm going to shift the focus to me for a second.
Sure.
I was reading the book, and I've recommended it to everybody. Anybody who's a Beach Boys fan, you need to have this book. I was struck by a quote on page 30 of the book, and it's a quote from a 2001 record collector interview with Brian, conducted by Ken Sharp. And he's talking about a song that Murry wrote, never published and never recorded, but a song that Brian remembered and called his favorite, a song called His Little Darlin' and You. And he sings the lyric to Ken Sharp. And the lyric is, when a bee loses his queen bee, his days are numbered, it's true. Kind of sounds like a Murry Wilson lyric. And in reading that, I nearly fell off my chair, because Brian has a song on his 2008 album, That Lucky Old Son. It was one of the bonus tracks on the CD, not part of the main album. But he has a song on there called Just Like Me and You. And the opening line is remarkably similar. The opening line of Brian's song is, when a man loses his woman, his days are numbered, it's true. Even the title, His Little Darlin' and You, Just Like Me and You, and there's no writing credit on his album for that song. And I just couldn't help but wonder, is it Murray's song? Is he incorporating elements of Murray's song into his song, just borrowing the lyric? And also, I was just dumbfounded that with everything we know regarding the tension between Brian and his father, that Brian would, in a way, sort of pay tribute, is what it sounds like, on his album.
Well, first, as I heard about that story that you just relayed, my first thought was, boy, hats off to you for putting that association together.
Well, thanks.
Because I thought honestly to myself, boy, I wish I had come up with that. I wish I had made that connection. And if there ever is a second edition, which I hope there is, I will certainly incorporate that in there and give you full credit for that. Because I thought that was just outstanding that you were able to make that association. And that's what I love about the book, because that's the kind of debate and robust discussion that I was hoping for. Little things like that, because that uncovers something, as you mentioned, is sort of neat, actually. Here's Brian recalling a song from when he was perhaps just an early teenager that his dad had written. I could not find any information about that song. It's not registered with BMI or ASCAP. It's not with the Library of Congress. It's not copyrighted. I could not find any sheet music or lead music or lead sheet rather to see if the melody carried over to Brian's song.
Right.
There's not a lot known about that song. I've not been able to ever find a recorded version of it, and I've searched, believe me, for years. Never say never. It may still show up, but it is quite fascinating that, here's a song from Brian's early teen years that he probably heard his father singing, loved something about it, the melody, the sweetness of it, and then, years later, decades later, incorporates, maybe a snippet, maybe more than a snippet, into a song that he uses as a bonus song. So, until you and the book sort of, intersect, no one really knows that. So it's cool that I think, Brian, I'm sure had a troubled childhood, in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
But I think Murry was and will always be his father. And I think there's a tendency between fathers and sons, no matter how difficult the relationship can be and how fractious it can be, that there's still a love there. There's still, Dad, you're flawed. Dad, you're this, but I still love you. So, perhaps that was a little way of Brian, kind of admitting that, my dad had some musical chops, and he could write a nice, pretty melody and a nice tune.
Well, I would recommend everybody to pick up the book, and maybe you can make some connections and discoveries and, and advance the story even further. Right. Jim, it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I think that song, Just Like Me and You, is a perfect note to go out on for this interview. BecomingTheBeachBoys.com, correct? That is the website people should go to?
That is the website, yes.
Well, Jim, we're going to let you get back to work then.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you. I hope your listeners enjoy it, and we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Hey, have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you.